Okay, well, we're right at 2 o'clock. Again, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to be here for a webinar presented by Deborah Grassman, Vietnam, Untold Stories at the End of Life. So first, I just want to quickly go through a little bit of housekeeping. Again, all participants, when you enter the webinar, you are automatically muted. I know that sometimes during our partner calls, we take time to do Q&A and share stories. On this webinar, we're going to let Deborah go ahead and run through her presentation and hold questions and input until the end. Now, at the end of the webinar, when we do open it up, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you will be able to raise your hand. When you raise your hand, that tells us that you have a question or you'd like to share a story, and we'll go through those in order. We'll go ahead and unmute you from our end. Another thing, if you'd like to chat with your fellow attendees or ask anything in the chat box during the webinar, you are more than welcome to. Again, if you hover at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little chat bubble. You can click on that and either send messages directly to Hope and I or to all of the attendees, completely up to you. I also wanted to mention, I think as I stated on our last partner networking call, the We Honor Veterans team, together with our dear Dr. Scott Shreve with the VA, is currently collecting stories and best practices related to caring for Vietnam veterans at the end of life. So we are going to leave some time at the very end of the webinar for you all to share. We are open to going over past the 3:30 mark. I know that this webinar is an hour and a half, and so I do want to be mindful of your time, but we would appreciate if we do go over, and if you have something to share, we will keep this open until everyone who would like to speak has a chance to speak. Okay, so without further ado, again, I know many of you are familiar with Deborah Grassman and her work. She is a nurse practitioner who provided hospice care at the VA for 30 years. During her time, she took care of more than 10,000 dying veterans, and those 10,000 dying veterans taught her lessons about how to attain personal peace, and ironically, those lessons came from people who were trained for war. Deborah came to realize that these lessons could be extrapolated to the general public, and that's when she and 4 other hospice nurses left the VA and founded the nonprofit Opus Peace, an organization that provides training and tools to people just like yourselves to take the soul injury message to their families, workplaces, communities, civic organizations, and faith communities as well. She is a contributing author for 3 textbooks. She has 22 published articles, and there are 3 documentary films featuring her work. She also has 2 published books, Peace at Last, Stories of Hope and Healing for Veterans, as well as The Hero Within, Redeeming the Destiny We Were Born to Fulfill. Again, one other note, I do want everyone to know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the We Honor Veterans website under our educational resources, following the webinar. Along with that, Deborah was kind enough to provide some handouts and guides and articles to go along, and those are actually up on the website right now, so you can access those at any time. Okay, well, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Deborah.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and I thank NHPCO as well for caring about veterans and for the work you're doing to honor them, and at this point, really caring about our Vietnam veterans and their needs, especially at the end of life. And so just to start with something that one of my patients said to me, this is what he said: I really can't describe how lonely military life is. One day you're a young man in familiar surroundings, and the next you're plucked up with hundreds of other soldiers and you don't know a one of them. You find yourself overseas where nothing is familiar, in the midst of a war that has given me a lifetime of memories that I've tried to shut out and run from as best as I could. No man should see some of the things that I have seen. So in my mind, the first part of what he told me that day really describes the physical sacrifices that our veterans have often endured. And then the next part, he describes, well, PTSD and those traumatic memories that haunt them. And then that last line, no man should see some of the things that I have seen, that soul injury that often surfaces. Now, you may be wondering why I start this program about Vietnam veterans with a quote from a World War II veteran. And there's several reasons why I decided to do that. One is that no war truly exists in isolation. So while we are focused on Vietnam, we have to understand the context and what went on preceding, which was World War II and Korea. Because the aftermath of one war lays the groundwork for subsequent wars. What I have noticed in taking care of many different generations of war veterans is that in many ways, war is war, and in many ways, wars are the same. And in other ways, wars are different. And certainly Vietnam was different. And so what I want to focus on initially here is the differences that made Vietnam different. Well, first of all, Vietnam was the first war really where there was extensive television coverage. So the American public was no longer shielded from the brutality of war. War could no longer be glamorized, and so it became a very political war. You may remember all the college protests, for example. You'll remember that when the soldiers came home, often they were spit upon right in the airport. They were called baby killers, murderers. And again, often I have to ask myself, where did their stories of trauma go? Because the truth is, we did not want to hear them. And so oftentimes those stories got locked up into unconsciousness. And often they don't reemerge until decades later when they retire, or certainly as they come to the end of life in hospice. Now, the literature calls this secondary wounding, and we're going to pay particular attention to that later in this presentation. The other thing that was different about Vietnam was there were no frontal lines of assault. So if you think about World War II, there were frontal lines of assault, and when you were behind your own lines between battles, you could sort of let down a little bit. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there can be any safe place in a war. But in Vietnam, there was no safe place. There were no frontal lines to be behind. The enemy could easily infiltrate. It was difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Commonly, I've had Vietnam vets tell me how they would carry food or candy on them to give to the village children, and the children would come out expecting this when they would see the soldiers. Only sometimes that child would be booby-trapped and blow up in front of that soldier's eyes. So you imagine seeing a child blow up in front of you and taking out your buddies with them. So it was a very different war. The research is pretty clear, and that is that there are two reasons why combat soldiers stay motivated to fight. They don't fight for themselves. They fight for cause, and they fight for comrades. And I think you can see that, for example, in World War II, these two motivating factors were very strong. In Vietnam, however, the fighting for comrades remained very strong, but the dissension about the cause of the war made that to be a lot more dissension and a lot of confusion around that. So the significance of that surfaces at the end of life is very important for us as hospice workers to understand, because sometimes what I would do is I would have a Vietnam vet come to the end of his life and say something like this: all that we sacrificed, all that we suffered for nothing. You see, that has a very different meaning than, say, a World War II soldier who might see a picture of Hitler on TV and they would swell up with pride and say, you know, we helped to stamp out evil from this world. So I think you can appreciate that a Vietnam vet coming to the end of his life, thinking that his sacrifice, his suffering was in vain, has a very different meaning than someone who feels otherwise. Other significant differences, I think, if you think about World War II, the average number of battles per year that a soldier was in was about 40 per year. And I don't know if you've thought about the average number of battles that a Vietnam vet was in, but they were in about 240 per year. So all of this has significance. You think about the suicide rate of our Vietnam vets. It's reported that more veterans, Vietnam vets, died of suicide after the war was over than died during the war. So I'm just going to say that one more time. There were more Vietnam vets died of suicide after they left Vietnam than died in Vietnam. And that statistic alone, in my mind, tells us just how difficult the aftermath of war can be. The other thing we're going to cover a bit today is about women. Sometimes we forget that women are veterans. We forget that the sexual assault rate in the military is quite high, and that can cause post-traumatic stress disorder. It's especially difficult when you think you're on a military base and you think you're safe and you're betrayed by trusted comrades. So that's an issue that we need to be aware of. Sometimes we forget that women served in combat. You see on your screen Marie Bainbridge, who is sitting here beside me. She's been the president of our Opus Peace Board of Directors for the past 5 years. And she's going to read to you a poem out of the book Visions of War, Dreams of Peace. This book was created by women who served in Vietnam. They suffered PTSD, and they used poetry and the arts to recover. So I've selected a few of these poems that Marie is going to read intermittently, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that means.
Do you really want to know how you can help me? Then don't turn your back on me as if I was to blame. You share in this too. I did the dirty work. The least you can do is listen to me.
So certainly from that, you can hear the bitterness in that nurse's, Bobby, I know Bobby is this is a female nurse. And you can also see how the assumptions that we make about male combat veterans applies to women as well. You can also hear the bitterness that might surround the Vietnam War with the way we as civilians did not want to listen. So let's talk a little bit about listening, and I'm going to say it's more than listening. What we want to do is to bear witness, and that means we have to use more than just our ears. So when you think about a Vietnam veteran who has PTSD, they may have a lot of suspicion and lack of trust. And again, we shouldn't be surprised by this. If your assumptions about the world being a safe place are violated at a young, impressionable time in your life, then you can appreciate that trust may be an issue for much of your life. Alcohol usage is common in this patient population. It is more high, and again, it makes sense. If you're repeatedly being bombarded with noxious wartime memories, what's an easily available, convenient way to numb those memories out? It is alcohol usage. These people with PTSD may have anxiety. They may have agitation, and that agitation might be an acting out of the trauma. In fact, I've had more than one patient describe it like this. They said they've had nightmares much of their life, but then when they get to the end of their life, the nightmare that they used to have unconscious while asleep, they are now actively experiencing while they are awake. They may have a lot of estranged relationships. PTSD is not easy on relationships. Alcohol usage isn't easy on relationships. You know, plain old living's not easy on relationships. And you can appreciate, in hospice we talk a lot about unfinished business, that these veterans sometimes have more than their share of unfinished business to sort out at the end of life, and that can make things a bit more complicated. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, talks about unfulfilled longing for the life not lived. And let me give you an example of this. I took a call from a case manager at a local hospital who wanted me to admit a patient with end-stage liver disease from alcohol usage. And he was homeless. And I accepted the patient for admission to our inpatient hospice unit at the VA the next day. That night, I had a dream about this man. And in the dream, I had gone into his room to welcome him onto our unit. And he stood up, and he was this tall, dashing, debonair man in a three-piece business suit. And then I woke up, and I thought, that's really odd. I took report on him. I know that's not what he's going to look like. Come to work the next day. The patient's admitted onto the unit. I go in to meet him and greet him, and sure enough, he was disheveled, ascites, all the things that I had expected, and I remained puzzled about my dream. Well, our whole team does what we call quality of life gatherings at the patient's bedside once each week. You know, the doctor, the nurse, social worker, chaplain, volunteer, all roll to the bedside. And I usually introduce the concept like this. I'll say, you know, we get so busy doing things, 2 people and, you know, 2 patients and 4 patients, that sometimes we just forget to be with you. And our team is here right now just to hear what might be on your mind and your heart. Well, this day, this particular man said that what was on his mind and heart was Vietnam. And I said to him, well, you know, none of us have been there. Tell us what that was like for you. And what he said is what you see on your screen. He said, when I looked into the eyes of the dead man, I saw peace. When I looked into the eyes of the living, I saw fear. And our whole team sat in stunned silence as we vicariously experienced war from that veteran's perspective. And after that meeting was over and I had gone back to my office, I kept pondering what that man said. And suddenly the meaning of my dream came to me, because I realized that the man I had met in my dream had not gone to Vietnam. And from that, I realized that war robs people of many things, but perhaps the most significant thing it sometimes robs them of is their hopes and their dreams for their future. What I want to say about this patient was that what he said to me was just the tip of the iceberg. The story is always large, and it looms under the surface, so to speak. And I can tell you that people with PTSD are going to test you. They do not know whether or not you have the capacity to hear the ugly things that they may want to tell you. So in a lot of ways, we have to kind of develop an unwavering ability to hear their story. And I can tell you that probably for the first 15 years of my VA career, veterans told me things like that veteran told me, and it just went over my head. I did not grasp the significance. So when I'm training people, when they would come on clinical rotations with me, the first thing I would always teach people is you have to recognize the significance of what a veteran says. Recognize how they will test you. And they're only going to tell you a little bit, and you have to read between the lines. So when we're talking about reaching out to our veterans, especially our Vietnam veterans, I'm going to say it starts at home. And many of you who've heard me speak have probably already heard this story, but you know that this painting had a rather significant impact on me. I'm embarrassed to tell you that for the first 10 years of my VA career, I harbored a prejudice against people with PTSD from Vietnam. And here's sort of how my thinking went. You know, that war was over a long time ago. They just need to get over it. They just need to get on with it. And what's with all the long hair and tattoos? You know, I had all this stuff running in my mind. And then one day our hospital was doing a call from veterans veterans artwork from throughout the whole state of Florida to do a display at our hospital. And on the day of the display, in this huge room filled with hundreds of paintings, I'm going through lickety-split until I get in front of this painting. And this painting stopped me in my tracks because suddenly I saw what that soldier saw. More importantly, I saw how he reacted. I saw the tears of blood, you see, the loss of vitality. And that's when my eyes were opened. More importantly, that's when my heart was opened. And I tell you this because people with PTSD do not trust easily. You can say all the right things on the outside, and if you harbor a prejudice like I had, they will not open up to you. They can sniff out a phony like a hound dog. And so we all have prejudices. If we think we don't, that's the real problem, because we all have this human brain that acts as a filter, and it's about bringing that filter out of the dark into the light so we can see how it is impacting our relationships. So the first question we might each of us want to ask ourselves is getting real and asking, what prejudices do I have? This is a picture of myself, my younger self, with the artist, Tommy Bills, you see there. One time I was in Montana, and I was speaking, doing Wounded Warriors, and in the audience was Diane Carlson Evans. And I don't know if you know who she is, but she is a very famous female Vietnam veteran who spearheaded getting the Women's Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and you see that on your screen. Well, she was in the audience that day. And so I asked her to come up to the podium, and she said something that I thought was very interesting. And she commented on this painting, and this is what she said. She said, this painting really captures what it's like to have PTSD. She said, one eye looking out, seeing everything you all do, and one eye always seeing Vietnam. So I'm going to ask Marie, actually on your screen is a picture of Marie when she was being inducted into the Army before she went to Vietnam. And so I'm just going to ask her to read another poem by another Vietnam nurse. And actually this Vietnam nurse, her name's Joan Fury, was my first med-surg supervisor at the VA here where I work.
Some days I can't help but remember when these very young men without their arms or legs or half their faces looked to me for hope, encouragement, strength, or peace. When hidden behind my smile of, it'll be okay, was the burden of the lie that knew that it wouldn't. Anger, the silent, stoic anger. The anger at the death, the anger at the carnage, the anger at the demands that could not be met, the pain that could not be stopped, the wounds that could not be healed, the tears that could not be shed. Become numb to the pain, become numb to the cries, become numb to the death. Walk away from the grief. When I finally came home, I came home to a life that no longer was real.
We talk a lot about when we send someone off to war, the person who comes back is not the same person. That person is changed forever by what they experience. So you can see the dichotomy not just for the patient, but also the family. One of the things I always teach families is the first thing that they have to do is they have to grieve the loss of the person they send off to war. Because that person, if they don't do that, then they will keep trying to make that person go back to the way they used to be, which is an impossible task and can only create conflict within the veteran themselves and within that patient family system. Well, on your screen now you see a graphic, and you can see that the number of Vietnam veterans that we are taking care of now exceeds Korean and World War II veterans, and you can see how that number is going to continue to climb for the next several years before it levels off. So again, you can appreciate why we are focusing on what we are focusing on today as we talk about our Vietnam veterans and how their needs may be a bit different than veterans in the past. Well, there are some important differences, I believe, in PTSD at the end of life. PTSD is different at the end of life. And maybe I didn't say it enough. PTSD is different at the end of life. Oh, and maybe I still didn't emphasize it enough. PTSD is different at the end of life. Now, if you're wondering why I'm saying it like this, it is this. In my mind, anytime we're on the hospice platform, we have to know what those differences are, and that needs to be our contribution to the PTSD community. Sometimes I get a little bit frustrated when I see hospice people just talking about PTSD without the context of end of life, because that's the missing puzzle piece, and that's the message that we need to be bringing to everybody, is that the response is different, and you can't approach PTSD always in the same way at the end of life. So let's look at what the issues are that emerge at the end of life. And this actually is, if you have not been to the Vietnam Veterans Museum in Chicago, I would recommend that you go. This quote I'm getting ready to show you is on a piece of art there, and to me it really summarizes well the issue at the end of life for our combat veterans. Hoping and wishing you can settle this whole thing in your mind about this war, resolving it within yourself before the time of atonement comes, weeping and crying at the end of your life. So I think you all work in hospice, you know how people, when people come to the end of their lives and they're getting ready to meet their maker, so to speak, that this idea of what kind of issues are unsettled from that war, maybe issues they've not thought about for decades, suddenly are right there in front of them. What I want to emphasize to a hospice community, because sometimes what I read in hospice literature, even about PTSD, is about how to avoid triggers. Well, here's the problem with that when you're dealing with hospice. It's not about avoiding the triggers, because guess what? It's about making peace with the trigger, because the triggers that they are facing that are coming up often are unavoidable. What's the trigger? Death itself. As they are facing their own death, if they were a combat veteran, the trigger is the deaths that they saw decades before. Increasing helplessness and loss of control. When you are dying, when you are coming to the end of your life, you lose more and more control. You become more and more helpless. And when you look at people in combat who have, and afterward, are people who were in dangerous duty assignments, because it's not just combat. When they suffer PTSD, you will find that often at the core of that is that sense of helplessness. If you have not read the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, I would suggest you do so, because one of the things that van der Kolk has the Center for Trauma in Boston, and we at Opus Peace really consider him to be one of the leading researchers about PTSD. But one of the things that he says is that PTSD is largely caused by immobilization at the time that the trauma, that you could not either escape or you could not fight back. In other words, that sense of helplessness. The other thing that occurs at the end of life is these memories start surfacing unbidden. It's not like they just want to go back there and revisit that stuff. It comes up anyway. And I think my conjecture is the reason for this is that the conscious mind starts receding at the end of life, and the unconscious mind starts expanding. And that's when these memories often surface unbidden. And the usual methods for trying to, stuff them down aren't always there as they get weaker. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that I saw these things happen every day as I dealt with hospice patients at the VA, and yet I didn't see it. I didn't recognize it. I called it terminal restlessness, for example. And many times it was. I'm not saying it wasn't. But again, it starts by being able to recognize and make that differential diagnosis when you're seeing agitation as to whether or not it's terminal restlessness, or whether, in fact, it might be PTSD expressing itself at the end of life as people are starting to feel more helpless. So when you look up in the DSM will say that children express PTSD differently than adults. The DSM says that children tend to act it out. Well, guess what the DSM does not know and does not say? Dying people express PTSD differently than non-dying people. At least that's what I have seen. And what do? They act it out. So again, I think we shouldn't be too surprised by this, but what we do need to be doing is we need to be talking more about how to make peace with the trigger. You can't avoid an unavoidable trigger. So if someone is dying and feeling more helpless, the key is being able to make peace with that. So let's tease this out just a little bit further, because I think this is an essential concept that we have to understand at the end of life. So again, if you have been involved in trauma that you cannot fight back, you can't run away from, let's just say a person has been raped. During the rape, the person feels overwhelmingly helpless. The day after the rape, what they essentially will say to themselves is, I will never put myself in a position to feel so vulnerable, so helpless again. I'm going to do everything I can to prevent it. I'm going to control everything. It is not unusual for people after they have been traumatized to become overly controlling. And the reason is so they can avoid feeling so helpless. In other words, overly controlling behavior is a way to numb out the feelings of helplessness. So at the end of life, what happens? We get weaker, we get more helpless. And as traumatized veterans get weaker and they come to hospice, they start feeling helpless, they start losing more control. Then they often get even more controlling. They try to, regain control, which can manifest itself as agitation. What do we do when we have an agitated patient? We give an anti-anxiety medication, often a benzodiazepine. And sometimes that helps, especially if it's just terminal restlessness. But if it's PTSD, it can often make them more agitated. In other words, you get a paradoxical reaction. Well, why is that? That's because a benzodiazepine makes you feel more helpless. And then the person fights harder to regain control. And that's, I believe, that's at least my speculation as to why we get these paradoxical reactions and a higher incidence of them in people with PTSD. So the take-home message that I would want you to think about is that an anti-anxiety medication decreases your control, makes you feel more helpless, and it is that feeling of helplessness that acts as a trigger for the original trauma. So you say, well, what do we do? What's the antidote? And I'm going to tell you that the antidote is rather paradoxical. So they're trying really, really hard not to feel the helplessness. So what do you want to do? You want to help them feel the helplessness. So there are, in fact, things that we have no control over, that we are helpless to stop, and death is one of those things. So what we want to do is help them to feel the helplessness without fear, without having to numb it out. Now, instead, often what we do in hospice is we actually collude with their control. Let's say a patient comes in and they're really, really weak. They can hardly get out of bed, but you've got this really strong, independent veteran, and they're going to keep doing everything no matter what. And they want to get out of bed, and they're going to do this and whatever it might be. And oftentimes, what I would see is you'd have this little exhausted wife, 75, 80-year-old wife coming in saying, oh, he's falling. He won't do anything I ask him to do. He just keeps pretending like everything, nothing has changed. And a lot of times they're admitted, if they would just kind of cooperate a little bit with the wife and listen to her, they could maybe stay home longer. But at any rate, then what do? They come into our unit, and initially I used to say, oh, you want to get out of bed? Okay, well, let me get you out of bed. Oh, you want to do this? Oh, well, let me do this. Instead, it's more having a conversation about how awful it feels to be losing their independence. So what I would learn to finally say is, most veterans tell me how awful it feels to be so helpless at this time. And then just sit there. And I cannot tell you how many times the reaction that I would see is that veteran start to cry. And what he would say, he would shake his head and tell me how awful it is to be this strong, independent veteran that is the protector of their family, now feeling so helpless, and to be able to talk about that has this paradoxical freedom that comes with it. And then you can spend your time doing the things and the energy, because their energy is so at a premium in those last few days, those last few weeks of life. They can spend their energy doing, having the conversations they might need to have with their family, whatever it might be. Now, veterans often, they would tell me, we're stubborn. We're a stubborn group, stubbornly independent. And they are. They often are. That was very important in the military. So it can become problematic, though, sometimes at the end of their life if they don't know how to lay that down. So more intervention. So we need to, number one, recognize that helplessness is the trigger, and we have to help people come to peace with that. We're going to talk in a minute about the anchoring heart technique, which is a somatic awareness technique we can use. And again, acknowledging and validating the helplessness, calling it what it is. And here's some just simple things that you can say. And these are all in the back of in the appendices of my book, Peace That Lasts. You'll find these things back there. But things like, you've been a doer and a giver. I can't imagine how you must feel now that you've become so helpless. Identifying that word. Sometimes helplessness can make people feel angry. Is that the case for you? How difficult is it for you to let go, to relinquish control? I know you're a doer and a giver. How are you about receiving? Are you the kind of person who can accept that things are changing and ask for help? I got to tell you, veterans do not like to ask for help. They don't like to put their call light on. They always think other veterans need you more than they do. They don't want to complain, those types of things. If you don't ask for help and you need help, what do? It can be very humbling to have to depend on other people right now. What else are you feeling helpless about? See, these are the conversations that we need to be having, in my mind. And I'm going to tell you that it's so difficult sometimes trying to penetrate this stoicism that often gets exerted at the end of life, that we actually, you see on your screen, we developed a little button. We call it the gracious receiver button. And here was what we would say. I would say to a veteran, I say, you know, you have given to your country, you have given to your family, you've given to your community. Now is the time for you to learn how to receive. Now is the cycle of life for you to let us give to you. And if you tell us what you need, that would actually help us. That would do us a favor. So I don't not only want you to be a receiver, I want you to be a gracious receiver. And then I'd very ceremonially pin that veteran. So as a good example, and this was something that was actually caught on camera, and we don't get to see that too often. One time I was speaking at SOCOM, the Special Operations Command in Tampa. Many of you might know that for the nation, it is at MacDill Air Force Base, not far from where I live. I was asked to speak about soul injury at one of their conferences. And then at the noontime, they had this special thing where they had all of us come out onto Tampa Bay, and they were doing a reenactment of a terrorist attack. They had bombs going off, they had bullhorns going off, they had what you see on the screen, this is a picture I actually took with my camera, but they had the Air Force coming in from above to do a rescue, and the Navy SEALs coming in from below, and you know, there were just throngs of people, and I'm just sitting there very engaged, looking at all that's going on, until I remembered who I was standing next to. And who I was standing next to was the president of our Opus Peace Board, Marie Bainbridge. And I want you to see the look on her face and what she heard, what she was seeing. And you see the look of terror on her face as she is hearing this. And when I looked over and saw her, what she said to me, and we're both tearing up a little bit as we're remembering this day, she said, I can't do this. I can't do this. Get me out of here. Get me out of here. And so what I did was I reached over and I placed my hand firmly on her heart, and I said, Marie, breathe. Breathe. And she did. And I want you to look at the change in expression on Marie's face. Now, we have come to call this the anchoring heart technique. We have used this for, I don't know how many years, many, many years now with our hospice patients. So this is what I want to kind of diagram out. If you look at what the change in Marie, what she was shifting from was, I can't do this, to, okay, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can do this. And Marie told me later, if you remember, she said she was actually flashing back. What she was hearing when she heard those bombs going off, what she was actually hearing was incoming, incoming. That's what she was actually hearing in her mind. So if you look at what was going on, Marie was connecting with the part of herself that was still holding those painful memories of when she was being inundated with mass casualties. She was re-owning this part of herself, holding those memories. She was telling her amygdala, which is the mid part of the brain that does that fight or flight or freeze response. She was telling her amygdala, it's okay, calm down, we're safe. In other words, stay home. You don't have to be triggered and just kind of disappear. There's a famous saying that says, neurons that fire together wire together. So what Marie was doing in that moment was doing some rewiring of those synaptic gaps. She was replacing trusting fear, because when there's danger in the environment, you better trust your fear to get out, or you may not survive. But she was in a non-dangerous environment, and what she needed to do was tell her neurons, no, you can trust me. You can trust me. We don't have to trust what we're hearing. So think about it. When you are calm and you're relaxed, your energy is down low and deep in your belly. And when you get anxious and upset, your energy comes up high, up near your throat. In fact, if you get bad news, you'll actually clasp your chest with your open hand, and you'll go, you'll gasp and kind of hold your breath. Why do we do that? Why do we grasp automatically our chest, because unconsciously we know that it helps to ground us. It helps us to keep us home in our own bodies. So I tell you that story, but I also want to tell you that with all of my training in, somatic body therapies, in PTSD, and I've taught this, that when Marie looked at me that day with that look of terror in her eyes and said, "Get me out of here," it was all I could do to not get her out of there. Because what I'm telling you is it kind of goes against the grain. When you are triggered, when you are feeling agitated and you're wanting to, ease that off, it's hard to remember that the idea might be to make peace with the trigger if it's not an actual danger trigger. The other thing I want to point out at the same time is, if this had not helped her, if doing that anchoring heart technique had not helped to bring her back into her body and to ground her again, I would have been the first to get her out of there. You do not try to overwhelm. So in hospice, what I would do is I would often be sitting at my patient's bedside with my hand firmly on their chest, because they would often be anxious at the very end of their life, and I would just sit there firmly with my hand on their chest, and certainly teach the family members to do that. And also, when you can do the anchoring heart technique approaching from the back. Let's pretend like, and I have been in veteran situations where they were triggered when I've been in audiences or large programs. And, let's just pretend like I did not know Marie, that she was a stranger. Well, I'm not going to stick my hand on her chest, especially if she's got PTSD. But I might let her, I might be able to put my hand on her back. In fact, in the military, they would even say, "I've got your back." And you give that firm grasp on the back. It's not, in hospice, we like to do a lot of patting. But I always say, don't pat. Don't pat. They don't need patting, that type of thing. It can be actually kind of minimizing. It can kind of be like, there now. And so no, they need strength at that moment. So what I'm going to do at this juncture in a minute is we're going to actually I want all the people listening to actually do the anchoring heart technique, because we can do it on ourselves as well. So the purpose of this is we're going to create an interior space whereby emotional pain and peace can sit side by side without fear, because mostly we are very afraid of emotional pain, aren't we? So this means becoming better acquainted with the part of yourself that's holding your pain. It means temporarily suspending numbing mechanisms that you may be using that disconnect you from this part of yourself that may be holding emotional pain. So even if it's only for a few moments, and we're only going to do this for about 3 or 4 minutes, it's not for a long time, but even if it's only for a few moments, you are going to find that getting a glimpse of this part of you that is strong and capable of holding your emotional pain, because that's the part of you that is holding it, has been holding it, it will actually help you reconnect with this part of yourself. So rather than letting the amygdala and the fear-based brain control you, it means learning how to make some different connections between the synapses of the nerve in your brain. And that will help you re-own pieces of yourself that you may have lost or forgotten. It'll help you learn how to rehome these pieces of self by creating safe interior space. And the result then is you can become reconnected, revitalized by the energy of your deepest self. So what I would like for you to do right now is just to lower your eyes, get in a comfortable position, and you'll just hear my voice for the next about 3 minutes, and lower your eyes or close them completely if you can, so that you can turn away from the outside world and focus just a little bit more on your interior world. And notice your breathing as it comes and goes so quietly, so effortlessly. Now let yourself take a few deep breaths, inhaling deeply, and then exhaling, letting the breath go, almost like a sigh of relief. Just do that a few times at your own pace, breathing deeply. And now relax the breath and just let your body breathe however it wants to. And now place one or both of your hands over your own heart. Tenderly anchor your heart with your support and your strength. Pay attention to how your heart may be closed or numbed with fear of emotional pain. And just for a few moments, let yourself think about something that might be a bit painful. Not a big hurt. Maybe it's a disappointment, a loss that stings but does not overwhelm. And just for this moment, let yourself feel that memory. The pain you are feeling is real. It is part of your experience. The pain is yours, but it is not you. It is not who you are. You can feel the pain that you have, but it doesn't have to define who you are. For just this moment, you can suspend your fear of pain and just let yourself be curious about how it is affecting you. You do not need to be afraid of who you are or who you are not. Be aware of this part of you that has been strong enough to hold this pain for you. Breathe deeply this part of yourself. Know that this too is a part of who you are. And as you prepare to slowly open your eyes, resolve to bring this part of you with you. Know that this is the place inside of you that is able to let pain and peace sit side by side without fear. So take a few more deep breaths as you slowly open your eyes. And if Bessel van der Kolk were here, what he would be telling you is that for you to have done what you just did means that rather than being in the amygdala where fear of emotional pain resides, you were in a different part, a medial section of your brain that does the integrating piece, and that's the part of the brain that you were activating. So I can tell you what you just learned to do with yourself, and you can also do it with others, can have very profound, you'll be surprised at how profound it can be. Especially, I can tell you, especially when you have people who have dementia. Their cognition may not be intact, but their emotions are intact, everything else is often intact, and their sense of touch is intact. And you can really help to calm them down, because when they come into strange environments, or if a stranger is coming into their house, that causes them to be very fearful, and being able to do that anchoring heart technique, to have their family do that anchoring heart technique, can be very helpful. So at this point, I want to introduce Ralph Osman. He's the director of our ambassadors at Opus Peace. He was the director of volunteers at Smoky Mountain Home Health and Hospice in Tennessee. You see a picture of Ralph on your screen, and you see at a fallen comrade ceremony, you see the back of him there with his Vietnam Navy vest on. So Ralph, I just wanted you to talk to them a little bit more about this anchoring heart technique, because I know after you learned it, you really took it to your company and did a lot of things with it. So if you can just tell them, I'd like for them to hear it from someone other than me.
Well, it was while I was attending an Opus Peace conference that I learned about the anchoring heart technique. But more importantly, I learned how to apply it to myself. Even though at that moment I was not experiencing any emotional distress or pain, I still felt its calming effect. And as you say, I was working for Smoky Mountain Home Health and Hospice out of Newport, Tennessee at the time. And the requirement of the owner was for conference attendees to report back to the company with what they had learned at the conference they attended. So I chose the anchoring heart technique for my report, and I was able to lead 200 employees through the technique. The very next day, one of our nurses and her assistant went out to change the wound dressing on a veteran patient. As the patient became combative, the aide said to the nurse, "Let's try that anchoring heart thing Ralph told us about yesterday." So the nurse placed her hand firmly but tenderly on the patient's heart. Speaking his name, she softly said, "Breathe, breathe." The veteran immediately calmed and allowed them to change his wound dressing without further incident. Then, just a few days later, another nurse, Debbie, happened to be passing through the waiting room of our local hospital emergency department and witnessed an elderly woman in hysterics as the ambulance personnel were rolling her in the entrance. Debbie walked up to them and asked, "Do you mind if I try something I just learned about?" When they gave her permission, she knelt down, then placed her hand firmly but tenderly on the woman's heart and softly said, "Breathe, breathe." The woman's frantic behavior calmed almost instantly. Even her countenance had changed, according to Debbie. The look of wide-eyed panic had been replaced with an accepting calmness. As you can imagine, the ambulance personnel, as well as those in the waiting room, were totally amazed by what they had just witnessed and asked Debbie, "What did you just do?" Nurse Debbie, who is also a community educator for Smoky Mountain, spent the next half hour teaching the anchoring heart technique to everyone in the waiting room, some of the emergency staff, and even to the ambulance personnel on their way back to the ambulance. A few days after the emergency room incident, Debbie walked into an office area of a doctor's office she called on. During the course of the conversation with this particular staff, everyone was telling Debbie what a bad day they were having. Some related how even before arriving at work, frustrating and stressful events had occurred. The more the doctor's staff talked, the more evident it became to Debbie that these stressed out medical professionals needed a moment of self-compassion. At this point, she led them through the 3 steps of the anchoring heart technique. When they finished, the staff remarked, almost with disbelief, how much lighter they felt, as if a weight or a burden had been lifted. And at the next doctor's office she called on that day, Debbie related what had happened at the previous doctor's office. That staff asked her to lead them through the anchoring heart technique. When they had finished, that staff also remarked how much lighter and yet stronger, more in control they felt. Due to the response she received that day, Debbie asked the company's marketing department to design a flyer describing the 3 steps to the anchoring heart technique. That flyer was then used as a special promotion during Heart Month. And this demonstrates how something so simple, something that can be used over and over again, the anchoring heart technique, can make a difference in so many lives.
So thank you, Ralph. The other thing I want to just mention as our veterans age, as our Vietnam veterans, who you see on the screen is a Vietnam veteran. It's actually Marie Bainbridge's husband. They are both Vietnam veterans. And so I want her just to tell the story, and you may not think about outside of hospice, but what our Vietnam veterans need as well when they get cataract surgery, for example.
Last year, my husband Jim needed cataract surgery. When they took him into the OR, they tucked both of his arms tightly under the blanket. Jim's anxiety escalated. Then they put a band across his forehead to keep his head still. He told them to stop and let him up. They tried to pacify him without any luck. He kept telling them he couldn't tolerate it. Finally, they sedated him. When we went back for surgery to his other eye, Jim repeatedly told the doctor to make sure he had enough medicine to sedate him, or else he wasn't going to be operated on. The doctor turned and said, "I heard you the first 5 times you said it, Mr. Bainbridge." That's when I spoke up. I told the doctor that he must have other veterans besides Jim who had the surgery, and he needed to be aware of PTSD and how restraints could cause agitation for combat veterans. Despite my explanation, the doctor didn't understand and unfortunately didn't seem to want to understand. It's just one more example of what our society does not know about the aftermath of war, but needs to start learning.
So again, that idea of restraining, rendering a veteran more helpless can actually have that paradoxical reaction where they become then agitated. So think in terms also, I know at our hospital for fall risk patients, oftentimes bed alarms, we would not use bed alarms on people with PTSD. You'll get that exaggerated startle response oftentimes. So in this next section, what I really want to look at is our assumptions and encouraging all of us to, as we are listening, to not make assumptions. We have to know the generalizations and the principles of that, for example, like I'm putting out there today, at the same time recognizing that they cannot become presumptive. You have to listen with that spectrum. On your screen right now, you see a picture of John Drinkard as he was participating in leading one of our Fallen Comrades ceremonies that we do. John is a chaplain and bereavement counselor at the Karen N. Quinlan Hospice in New Jersey. He is a Vietnam veteran. He was a Marine pilot, and his father was a World War II veteran. So if you were the hospice person coming to visit him and you're going to be listening to him, he's going to tell you his story in just a second. I want you to be thinking in terms of what might John's unfinished business be. So John?
Oh, thank you, Deborah. So I could tell you about the 3 helicopter crashes I was involved in during my military service. And I could tell you about the PTSD I suffered after Vietnam. And I could tell you what it's like to be a combat Marine, but I won't. If I was dying and you came to visit me, The issue that might continue to be unresolved for me is my father wound. It's a wound that occurred when I was 9 years old that left me feeling worthless, defective, and inadequate. Like I didn't really matter in my father's life. Interestingly, much of my father's angry behaviors were probably caused by his own PTSD from World War II. In other words, some of my struggles resulted from being a family member of a combat veteran. From him, I learned how to use anger to disguise my hurt, as well as other numbing agents. And I didn't realize until I started doing my soul injury work that what I thought was anger for many, many years was really unmourned grief. So if this soul injury, this father wound that I sustained early in my life, surfaced at the end of life, I hope that others will be able to recognize it and respond to it.
Thank you, John. So again, what I want to, the point I want to make is don't spend your time on wartime issues if they aren't issues. So you see, I love that picture of John there. I don't know how old you were, John, about 2 or 3, but already you kind of looked like a military guy there. But at any rate, again, it's so easy, you know, if you had John, you know, in your midst, that you would make the assumption and spend the time on his issues around Vietnam. But he's already done a lot of that work, you know, and at the core was this work with his father. And so sometimes we call that an insidious soul injury, and that's where you might want to spend your time. So real quickly, I'm going to give you the definition of soul injury. At Opus Peace, we define it as an overlooked wound that separates you from your real self, and your real self includes that inner sense of goodness and beauty. It's an aching wound that gets perpetuated by unmourned loss, unforgiven guilt and shame, and diminished self-compassion. And that often ends up being manifested as a sense of emptiness or a loss of meaning or a sense that a part of self is missing or defective. So again, when we look at Marie, Marie has PTSD, she will say that there are times when she gets triggered and she has difficulties with some PTSD. But she would say she does not have a soul injury. She said she grew up in such a loving family. She said that not even Vietnam could squeeze me out of myself. So you can see, here's John and Marie, both right here with us today. And both of them have been to Vietnam, but both of them with PTSD, one where you might want to focus on Vietnam, one where you would not. So we just have to be very careful about the assumptions that we make. You may say, well, why do we use soul injury rather than moral injury? You know, the VA and the Department of the Defense speaks about moral injury. There's a lot. I'm so thrilled. There's so much research coming out now about that. Their definition is that it's a violation of deepest held beliefs that create moral conflict or moral confusion. And you can appreciate that moral injuries really do surface at the end of life. The problem that we had sometimes when we talked, and the only reason we really use a larger term that we use soul injury is we see moral injury kind of as a subset. And with the definition of moral injury, there's a lot of judgment. It's about, you know, right and wrong. And sometimes what veterans would say to us when we would use that term with them, they would say, well, I don't know about a moral injury. You know, when you're in a kill or be killed situation, you do what you have to do to stay alive. So we had some pushback, and what we see is that soul injuries, for example, with John, what he experienced with his father as a child, John had not done anything right or wrong. If you think of a child who has been molested, they don't even have any moral beliefs to be violated yet. So that's why we see moral injury as a hugely important subset of a broader injury that we call soul injury. So soul injuries do tend to easily surface at the end of life, and that's because I think what happens is that unvarnished truth tends to surface at the end of life. So what you want to do, you want to spend your time uncovering these soul injuries. And many of them might, in fact, relate to war. They do often. Next month, I think it's on August 29th, I will be doing a webinar with NHPCO on soul injuries, and we will talk more about this specific thing. So coming back specifically to Vietnam and reading another poem by Diane Carlson Evans, Marie.
If our country could have known but one dying man alone in Vietnam, with that look on his face and hopelessness in his eye, if this country could have seen the courage he had and concern for his friends, if this country could have wept in his tears and told him he was good, if only this country would have listened, they would have learned of his experience and his sacrifice, and then told him they were proud. If only there would have been a thanks.
So what she is describing, what Diane Carlson Evans is describing, is secondary wounding. What I've heard many times from Vietnam vets is they'll say something like this to me. What happened to me in Vietnam was bad. What happened to me when I came home was worse. So therein lies some of the difficulties, and I think you can appreciate this whole movement, and Mary German's going to talk about that a little bit later, about the movement to welcome our Vietnam vets home springs from this. You also heard in that poem just a bit of bitterness once again, and I'm going to tell you that bitterness is a poison that greatly complicates peaceful dying. So I want to talk a bit about the secondary wounding. I think it is essential that we have an understanding. If we talk about Vietnam, we have to talk about this secondary wounding. And I'm going to give you a parallel that we might be able to understand a little easier. Let's just pretend like you have a child, a little girl who's been molested by her father. She goes to her mother and reports this. The mother could have one of three responses. The mother could say, oh my goodness, that will never happen again. I'll make sure it never happens again, and I'll get you help because it did happen. All right, that's one. The mother could say, oh, well, gee, let's just don't talk about it. Just don't be alone in the room with him. Just come get me. Don't tell anybody about it, though. All right. Third response the mother could have. The mother could say, he would never do something like that. And if he did, you must have done something to have caused it. My question to us is this. Would that child's recovery be different based on the mother's response? And I think we can all categorically, easily see that it would. The first child that I told about would not have much risk of getting PTSD, and the last child that I told you about would have much higher risk for getting PTSD. All right, let's apply this to veterans. Think of World War II veterans. How did we meet and greet and treat them when they came home? We open arms, parades. If you would have said anything bad about a World War II veteran, something bad would have happened to you. If you fast forward to the Korean War, although we don't even call it a war, we call it a police action, we call it a conflict, sometimes we call it the forgotten war. And that is often how we treat our Korean War veterans. We minimize or ignore what they went through. And then if you fast forward to Vietnam, again, as we have talked about already, where they were so mistreated. They were called right-in airports, murderers and baby killers. And we blamed them for that war. It is no wonder that they have a higher incidence of PTSD caused by us civilians, the secondary wounding. And the other thing I want to say about secondary wounding is people often will say, for example, I've dealt with many people adults who were molested, let's say as a child, and they will say it is harder to forgive their mother for not protecting them once she knew than it was to forgive the original molester. So that's the same thing with Vietnam. What happened to me in Vietnam was bad, but what happened to me when I came home was worse. And it is harder to do that forgiveness work, and that's why that bitterness can sometimes remain. So watching your assumptions, have any of you ever thanked a veteran and they don't want to be thanked? So what I can tell you is many times I would be wanting to thank veterans, and sometimes they'd say things like, well, I didn't do anything. I wasn't on the front lines. I was just a cook in the back, and but I wanted to thank them, so I would tell them, oh yes, but, and I would give them all the buts that I had. It took me a long time to start listening to them. And what I realized was that in fact there is a spectrum of sacrifice. And indeed, someone who has died on the battlefield, and sometimes they would say that to me, they would say the ones you should be thanking aren't here. They're still on a battlefield overseas. So what they were trying to say to me was there's a spectrum of sacrifice. And dying on the battlefield is indeed the ultimate sacrifice. And I've taken care of a lot of people who played in a military band, for example. And I remember one guy, he said, here I was getting paid to do what I loved to do. That was no sacrifice. So, but of course I had my butt, and I told him all my reasons why. But my point is, they were trying to tell me is there's a spectrum of sacrifice. So now I have learned to do it differently. There's a famous military saying that goes like this: some gave all, and all gave some. All military people pretty much know that. So what happens when I have resistance a lot of times, what I will say to a veteran, I'll say, you're right. Some gave all, and all gave some. Tell me about the some that you gave. And then just sit quietly, and oftentimes the story will come forth. And I was speaking one time at the University of Iowa, and I had all the veterans stand up that morning, and we'd gone out and pinned them. And then after the day was over and I was in the back of the auditorium signing books, this woman came up to me. This is what she said. She said, I just want to thank you for that explanation about the spectrum of sacrifice. She said, I'm a veteran. And I kind of looked at her because I knew she had not stood that morning. And I'm looking for her pin, and I didn't. She said, you're right. She said, I was in the Army for 20 years. 20 years. She said, and I did not consider myself a veteran until today. When you explained that, she said, because I thought, in my mind, veterans were only people that went overseas. And I served all 20 years in the United States. So she said, I'll accept that pin now. So anyway, she was crying and I was crying, of course. But at any rate, again, that idea of we can't lump everybody in the same category. And whether they want to be thanked or they don't want to be thanked, what I will tell you is it invites a story. If they don't want to be thanked, I guarantee you there's a story there that you want to hear. So, and I think that as important as it is to do these pinning ceremonies and what have you, and again, I'm really proud that the 5 of us little VA hospice nurses started those pinning ceremonies 20 years ago, and so pleased that NHPCO and the We Honor Veterans program has picked that up and has gone all over the country. We feel very proud of that. But as important as those pinning ceremonies, I'm telling you that those are just the vehicles. That's not the goal. It's the vehicle to get the story. And oftentimes what you're going to hear, and I know you all have heard this, is the family members are sitting there going, oh, we never heard this before. So we do have to be aware of our own agenda. As I said, when I was going to thank that veteran, I was going to thank that veteran whether they wanted to be thanked or not, because that was my agenda. And we have to be careful about, I always like to hear the story first before I thank them. sometimes I can get a little bit trite otherwise. You see another picture of Marie. This is a picture of her at work at the VA. You see her card there, and you see on her card some yellow, red, and green beads. These are the colors of service in Southeast Asia. And what I'm going to tell you is these beads can only be made by Vietnam veterans. And you see we do a fallen comrade ceremony, and there's some beads that we have used for our Vietnam vets that Marie and her husband both make for our program. And I want to tell you that when you see Marie take those beads off of her uniform and reach down and pin that Vietnam veteran dying in that hospice bed and reach down and pin him and welcome him home, you will see magic happen right before your eyes. And too often, sadly, what you will hear from that dying veteran is, you were the first person who has welcomed me home. So again, I want you to think about finding your Vietnam veterans in your community and having them make these for your agency and to include that as part of your program. I think you'll find that it's helpful to those community veterans as well as those hospice Vietnam veterans. So again, and I'm going to go briefly as we try to wrap up, just a real quick question. Most combat veterans have PTSD, true or false? And the answer is false. Most combat veterans do not have PTSD. The incidence for Vietnam is reported to be about a third. It's probably higher because it often is underreported. But again, don't just make that assumption just because a person's a combat veteran that they automatically have PTSD. Most do not. Most veterans are male, true or false? That is true. The problem is because it is true, we tend to forget that females also. In fact, right now, for those of you, because I'm sure some of you are watching this in groups, if there are any of you who are a female and are a veteran, I'd like for you just to stand up, because I wouldn't be a bit surprised if no one else in your environment may even realize that. So I'm going to skip on. So just be careful about your assessments, your assumptions. Make sure and assess first. So I want to move on a little bit beyond to looking at our families of Vietnam veterans, because they're a part of this picture as well. And this poem, I think, particularly to me, captures this.
What did you do in the war, Mommy? Hazel eyes shining brightly. I wrote a story about a war, Mommy, where nobody got guns or dead. This was a good war. Why do you have tears now, Mommy?
So this really points out the systemic and generational wounds. PTSD does not exist in a vacuum. It affects whole family systems, whole generations of family systems. I've had adults who were children at the time of the Vietnam War say some of these things to me. One woman told me, "I hated Peter Jennings on the news. He called my dad a, quote, hired killer. Somehow I felt responsible." Another person told me, "We were stationed in Japan. Demonstrators actually came on base to harass not only the soldiers, but us kids. It was scary. I didn't understand what was happening." And another woman said, "I hated social studies. The other kids knew my dad was in Vietnam and blamed me for it." So again, I want you just thinking in terms of families. And it just happens that our executive director at Opus Peace, Angela Sipe, is the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. And Angela, if you just want to briefly speak about that. Or not. Oh, we can't hear you if you're on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Hi, okay, great. Nice to be with everyone. It is incredibly difficult to see my father, who has PTSD, now that he has retired. His PTSD was successfully subconscious prior to his retirement. When life's busyness kept those emotions, it pushed away. and below the surface. But now, as he states, he goes to Vietnam every day. So I'm going to take the latitude today, since it is my 50th birthday, and my dad, who was in Vietnam during my early birthdays, to offer my birthday wish for him and all his Vietnam comrades, a prayer and a wish to have a sense of peace in their heart and in their soul.
Thank you, Angela. And what you see on your screen, I mean, this was the most poignant moment. We were doing a fallen comrade ceremony. Angela's father, and you see him there in the center, came forward. And you see John Drinkard standing behind him doing the anchoring heart technique, and Angela at her dad's side as he literally sobbed as he released the burdens that he had been carrying. So again, thank you for that blessing, Angela. Yes, for all of our Vietnam vets. So I also want to introduce Sue Gibson, because families, it's not just children of Vietnam veterans, but also spouses as well. And I've shown a picture of Sue's husband on the screen as well, as he spoke at one of our Fallen Comrade ceremonies. So Sue, we can hear you?
All righty. Thanks, Deborah. Well, I guess the first thing I want to tell you is when I was 7 years old, my Marine was in the jungles of Vietnam fighting for his life and his comrades. When I met him 20 years later, he was the embodiment of John Wayne. Rough and tough and so good looking, and he was always in charge. Yet, he was so very tender with me. The night he asked me to marry him, he told me this hilarious story about being ambushed in Vietnam and being so wounded that they thought he was dead. And with the humor of a stand-up comedian, he described how he was placed in a body bag. But before they closed it, the corpsman saw him move ever so slightly. I tell you, he had me laughing so hard, I almost couldn't breathe. And the seriousness and the horror of what he was telling me never registered, and didn't seem to register with him either. He told me that night that if I married him, I would never be bored. Boy, was he right. We married 35 years ago, and my 2 children and his 2 children became one family. The first 9 years were amazing. Then the coal mine that he worked at was sold, and the new company severanced out the entire supervisory staff. Suddenly, Bruce was 50 years old and he had no job. He became isolated, angry, irrational, condemning, and unable to hold a job. We went from not wanting for anything to not even having enough money to pay the $5 for my son to get a haircut. I began to take on more and more of the responsibilities for our family, so he didn't have to deal with the stress. He began to move from one job to the next, often just quitting, seemingly without concern over how our family would survive. There was not enough money to pay the bills and to buy groceries. Finally, he went to the VA and we were told about PTSD. Wow, what a relief. We now had a name for the craziness, but his condition continued to escalate. Then I had this brilliant idea that I could save him. I could cure him of his PTSD. I would leave my job as a hospice nurse and become an over-the-road truck driver with him. You see, if I was with him, then I could control all the triggers, all the memories, and keep him functioning, and together we could provide for our family. Well, that only lasted for about 4 months. I told you it was a brilliant idea. I couldn't take the fear that I was not competent enough to ensure our children did not end up as orphans. Once I came off the road and returned to nursing, it was a downward spiral for Bruce, and we began the fight for service-connected compensation. It took 3 years, but we finally won. If it had not been for the original love we shared and our faith in God, I'm not sure we would have even made it. So I hope that we can address the soul injury that the families of our veterans sustain in the aftermath of war and trauma. I hope that we, as civilians, will learn how to be safe havens for the pain, the shame, and the sense of helplessness that the families often carry.
Thank you, Sue. Sue has lived it. The rest of us who don't live with Vietnam vets are kind of tourists to the country, but she is a native of that land. Thank you, Sue. So I'm going to show a slideshow, and then I'm going to just finish up with forgiveness, and then we want to entertain stories. Quotes you see on your screen are quotes that I have heard from veterans, most of them as they were in the last few weeks of life. I release and let go in the silence of my soul. I release and let go my soul. I forgive every wrong as I sing this simple song. I forgive every wrong, my soul. I release and let go in the silence of my soul. I release and let go my soul. I release. I let go. So I think you can see these are the issues that surface at the end of life. And you can see that forgiveness is a huge piece of this work that veterans have to do. They have to forgive themselves for having killed other people. They have to forgive themselves for not killing. I've had more than a few that would say something like, oh, I was such a coward, I couldn't do it, they had to take me off the front lines. If they have often a lot of times survivor's guilt, feel guilty about not dying. If they committed friendly fire, in other words, killed one of their own, that's a different layer of guilt yet. They have to forgive the enemy. They have to forgive the government for using and betraying them if they are a Vietnam vet. They have to forgive the world for being like it is with war in it. And if they have to forgive God for allowing the world to be like it is with war in it. And again, if they are unable to do that before they come to the end of their lives, then they arrive at the end of their lives filled with bitterness. And bitterness is a venom for the soul that greatly complicates peaceful dying. So when people are trying to tell you at the end of their lives how guilty or ashamed they feel about something, don't dismiss that with well-intentioned platitudes. So because for what they're really searching for is forgiveness. And it's true we cannot change our past, but we can change our relationship to the past. And the means by which we do that is called forgiveness. So, Marie, you want to read this last one? Yeah.
We went to the war. We came back to chaos. We went with the values of healing and caring. We came back with the hatred for a nation. We went believing in a just cause. We came back suspicious of our great leaders. We went thinking our young bodies immortal. We came back knowing we were used and fragile. We went innocent and forgiving. We came back embittered and intolerant. We went alone and open. We came back alone and isolated. We went whole and unwise. We came back fragmented and wise. We went to the wall. We came away with hope.
And you might be surprised with that last line. We went to the wall and we came away with hope. This points out the value of war memorials. They often act as catalysts to precipitate reconnection with that part of themselves that they often have numbed out or compartmentalized, and it helps them reconnect with the pain in their soul. There's a photograph on your screen that was left at the Vietnam Wall Memorial. It was taken off of the dead body of a North Vietnamese soldier by the American soldier who had killed him. And there was a note attached to this photograph, and here's what the note read. Dear sir, for 22 years I've carried your picture in my wallet. I was only 18 that day we faced one another. Why you didn't take my life, I'll never know. You stared at me so long, armed with your AK-47, and yet you did not fire. Forgive me for taking your life. So many times over the years, I have stared at your picture and your daughter. Each time, my heart and guts would burn with the pain of guilt. Forgive me, sir. So my question is, if this veteran was at the end of his life and his path crossed yours at whatever agency you work for, what do you think would be on his mind and his heart if he had not achieved this earlier in his life? Because I guarantee you, this would be the issue that he would want you to know how to respond. At Opus Peace, we truly believe that there is a gaping wound in our society that is filled with unmourned loss and unforgiven guilt and shame. And we in hospice have that opportunity to be able to help them release that. So let's talk about just very briefly, here's your final question. Your hospice patient's a Vietnam War vet. He tells you, I'm afraid that when I die and I get to the pearly gates that they won't let me in because of some of the things I did in the war. What is your best response? You were just following orders. You were being a good soldier. War is ugly. Any of us in that same situation would probably have done the same thing that you did. Whatever you did, God can forgive. Some vets have told me that they lost their soul in that war because of what they saw and what they did. It sounds like you have been struggling with that a bit too. So I'm going to tell you, in my mind, that D is the answer. Even though all these other things might be true, you want to help them rather than giving them a platitude or trying to make, you want them to discover and reconnect. And that last sentence has the best opportunity to help open the door and let them know that you are a safe place to hear whatever it is that might be in there. So I just use that as an example. When you are looking at guilt and shame, you don't want to be saying things like you were just doing your duty following orders, even though that is true. Or you just need to let that go, or that's over and gone. You don't need to be thinking about that now. The other thing is volunteers. I know most hospice agencies now have volunteers who are veterans, and they assign those veteran volunteers to patients who are veterans. And that's exactly what we want to happen because there's a camaraderie that strikes up very quickly. However, if that veteran volunteer is not properly trained, then they're going to be very stoic as well. And as soon as that veteran hospice patient's trying to tell them how guilty or ashamed or they start crying, then that untrained volunteer will say, well, you got to suck it up for those types of things. So at any rate, the other thing we've got to remember is a lot of times what we do is we will label these patients difficult, and they are, but that becomes a code word for, you know, just kind of get in and get out as fast as possible. So let's look at how to do that just slightly differently, and that is just saying things like, you probably saw a lot of ugly things during that time. And then those 3 dots just sitting there, and just let them either open up to that and accept that or reject it. And then you follow them wherever they go. Is there anything that might still be troubling you now? I mean, to me, that's the operative question. And again, those 3 dots, saying less, asking, crafting a question or a statement very carefully, letting it hang in the air, and let that veteran do with it what they want to do with it. You don't ever want to push people to tell their story of trauma. I think we do damage if we do that. And I also think we do damage if we don't know how to create a safe emotional space so that story can come forth if they so choose. That's called abandonment. We need to listen without judgment. And again, we need to make sure our volunteers who are veterans that are getting assigned to veterans are well trained. And then when these things, when these guilt issues and shame issues surface, then oftentimes we need to have a team within our own agency that can really specialize. And often times that is chaplains and social workers who can provide that service the best. And I think it is fine to label them difficult because they are, but it shouldn't be a code word to disconnect from them and get in and out as fast as possible. It should be a code for, hey, we need to use a different approach. This person needs more love, not less love. They need more collaboration, not less. So this idea of secondary wounding, you need to ask about it with our Vietnam vets. You need to acknowledge it, I believe, and apologize for it. What I would do when I would hear this story and the bitterness from a Vietnam vet, before I would leave their room, I would reach out to shake their hand, or I would kneel down in front of them and I would say something to the effect of, I am so sorry for the scorn and the indignities that you had to suffer because of our ignorance. Please know that you are a hero, and that unsung heroes are the most worthy kind. And I will guarantee you that every time you will see a veteran, tears. They often tear up. But more importantly, what I would see is a soldier brought home from war at last. So again, I'm gonna skip this slide. Marie has already warned me that she would be too tearful. She couldn't read that last poem at any rate, so we're getting out of time. I just want to mention our Fallen Comrades ceremonies that we at Opus Peace provided is our response. This is a picture of me when Andy Balafas with Vitas had me come up to the Chicago area to speak at the Vietnam Wall Memorial. And one of the things I did was reached out to the veterans and apologized to them for what we as civilians had done to them, and asked them to consider forgiving us when they went out and touched that wall. Our Fallen Comrades ceremonies that we developed really started at a state veterans home, and one of the patients had said, you know, my brother and I both went to Vietnam, but only I came back home. When I asked him what was still troubling him now, here it was, 40 years later, this is what still bothered him. We ended up doing a ceremony for that brother, but we included all the veterans that wanted to come who had experienced similar losses. About 40 veterans came, and that was our very first Fallen Comrades ceremony. It is on that documentary film, Go in Peace. You're probably familiar with that. Many hospices use that for training. So as we're closing out here, I just want to give Bruce, if you can go online, because Bruce came to one of our Fallen Comrades ceremony as a veteran and experienced it. So Bruce, if you can just say what you wanted to say.
Thank you, Deborah. I said I was 18 when I volunteered to join the Marine Corps. I am a Vietnam combat Marine veteran. Like many others, my soul was injured during my military service. I have PTSD. I have carried pain and shame for things that I experienced while I was in the military, a pain that I shared with no one. I attended a Fallen Comrade ceremony while my wife was receiving training at the Opus Peace Leadership Institute for Soul Injury. My life changed during that ceremony. I want you to know is that opening my heart to the pain of the memories was very scary for me, but I did it anyway. Something in me recognized that this ceremony was an opportunity to heal the wounds that my soul still carried all these years later. Writing the names of my fallen comrades on the rock symbolically gave me a place to put the memories versus the memories just hanging out there and sabotaging my life and my family's life when I didn't expect it. I still get triggered fairly often, but when that happens, I remember writing the names on that rock and tell myself that is where the memory belongs now, and that helps me come back to the present moment.
So it's so important with our veterans, again, the idea of ritual and ceremony, because that's what accesses the unconscious, and that's what can provide such powerful means for them to be able to heal these the PTSD and the soul injury. Thank you, Bruce, for sharing. You actually get to see him there in his face there that very day. So I don't want to purport the Fallen Comrade ceremonies and others to be a magic cure. They are not, but it definitely creates an environment where the reconnection can happen. And Sue, just briefly, if you want to just say what you have seen with Bruce after that ceremony, what happened?
Oh, well, I received a whole brand new husband. He now lives he actually lives life and doesn't just, and he participates in life. I am learning how to be a new wife.
There you go. So again, I just wanted you all in the audience just to, hear it from other people than just me. So I'm going to skip over that next slide because we don't have time, and just tell you that resources, remember there are veteran centers, vet centers. They're actually called vet centers. A lot of people don't realize that. They are not located within the VA, so they're probably out in your communities, your C-Box, your community-based outpatient clinics, all your clinical resources. And the nice thing about veterans, vet centers, is they were formed by Vietnam veterans because the Vietnam veterans didn't trust the VA back then. So they were started by Vietnam veterans. Now they extend care to lots of others. And they also do pay attention to bereavement care. So that's how vet centers are just a little bit different. You've got the ncptsd.org there on your screen. And definitely, as you all well know, you're participating in the We Honor Veterans program and what all they are doing. I know Cynthia Robotham is starting to do the veteran-to-veteran cafes up there in the New England area, and John DeSilva and Christine Miller doing the soul injury program, teaching through Amedisys. Smoky Mountain Home Health and Hospice is starting to embed soul injury in their staff culture. The Welcome Home Vietnam Veterans Day, I think that was March 30th in Maryland as a statewide program. And Mary German, I think you're on the line if you want to briefly describe what that was like. That was really something to behold when I was up there on March 30th.
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's a wonderful event, and it was our fourth annual Welcome Home Vietnam Veterans Day event. And it is a formal event that is supported by so many in the community here, from high school students to veteran service organizations who set up booths, to our midshipmen who did pinnings as the Vietnam veterans walked into the Hilton, our local near the BWI airport. And there were so many things that went on, and it was like I said, it was a formal event, and it was a way for them to connect with one another before the actual program started. There was an invocation, presenting of the colors, an honor salute, a group honor salute. Deborah Grassman blessed us with her presence and sharing some of what she shared here with us today. It was quite something, and we have received so much positive. We have, year after year, people will show up, Vietnam veterans will show up hours early to just get in there. So it's something that is quite phenomenal. This year, 2 of our hospices in the area hosted the event as 2 separate events. So it's starting to build onto itself.
Thank you, Mary. And just so you all know, they had about 700 there. How many were vets? I would guess about half were veterans, about half were veterans' families. So they had about 700 people there. So this is no small thing. So I think it's important. The other thing you may not think about, but what I have discovered and hadn't really thought about before, but the community nursing homes are just a gold mine to be doing these types of ceremonies. We've done many, many in community nursing homes. So if you haven't done an outreach about doing some type of ceremony or the Fallen Comrade ceremony in a nursing home, it's an opportunity. Again, the Hospice Veterans Partnership, find out where yours is close by and consider joining it. Opus Peace, our nonprofit, our 501c3 is going to be offering Opus Peace memberships at a corporate level, so that you can incorporate a lot of these materials into your practice. If you're not familiar with these 2 pamphlets on your screen, the one is written by me, the 4 Final Life Lessons, and I wrote that pamphlet specifically for dying veterans, and it's written to them. It's not written to the clinician, it's written to them. And Pat McGuire wrote the one up for the veterans' families. So those are available. If you want to inquire at your local Dignity Funeral Home, you can just Google that, and they often provide those without charge. And don't forget that our veterans are entitled to burial at the closest national cemetery. We do have some educational films, the Go in Peace, and those of you who are wanting to be a level 5, you're going to be probably need to get familiar with some of these as resources. But Go in Peace is a film made by Karen Von Buren, and she's a documentary filmmaker out of Colorado, and she documents the work of my work and Ed Tick's work, and Ed Tick works specifically with Vietnam veterans. Of course, Wounded Warriors, Their Last Battle, many of you I'm sure have already seen that, but that is available on our website. It is free of charge. We also have a film that is available called Soul Injury, Liberating Unmourned Loss and Unforgiven Guilt. That is available, will be on our new website that will be available soon for you to purchase, and also Hospice Foundation of America, and Hospice Foundation also has a new film that just came out that we did called Liberating Unmourned Loss. So Catherine already mentioned the 2 books, so those are available as resources, and educational articles that are available that have been published that are on their website. If you're interested in being trained to do some of these programs that we're talking about, our next institute where we train people will be October 15th through the 18th in Tampa, so you can go on our website if you are interested in being part of this movement to respond to the aftermath of war, and that includes addressing soul injury. And we'd encourage you to use our website as well. So the level 5 We Honor Veterans partners that are going to be coming out, we want to make sure that we are moving the program into a deeper level. It's not just more of just the same. It's not just about raising awareness anymore. It's not just about providing education. Level 5 means that there is a deeper, more nuanced practice that is occurring, that there are pinning ceremonies that are happening that encourage that storytelling, that there are techniques being used to come to peace with loss and guilt and helplessness and soul injury. This is taking it to that next level, which is why we wanted another level, that there is that type of communal intervention. So my last slide is this. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And I would contend that you are on this call today because you are a thoughtful, committed person that, like we at Opus Peace, have been caring for the aftermath of war, and we have seen too much agitation at the end of a veteran's life. We have seen too much PTSD that continued to haunt them through decades of life. And that our agenda is truly to recognize and identify the lessons that these dying veterans have and bring those lessons upstream so that people can not only die healed, but they can actually live healed. So with that, Catherine, I know we've gone quite over, and we've probably been back that I just kept going. So I apologize. And at the same time, you can edit it down if you need to.
Well, we did not want to interrupt. I know some of our participants did need to hop off, but there were some questions coming in, and I do want to address anyone who would like to share stories or best practices about their time working with Vietnam veterans. Just looking at the chat box and through other things, one of the main questions that came up was surrounding the beads. So protocols around these, where can folks get them? Any advice that you could give them on that?
So it is posted on our website. If they go on our website, Marie has written up where you can purchase the beads and then how that is. So they can find that on our website under tools.
They have to make them.
They can't purchase them. The Vietnam vets have to make them. That's the primary protocol, is that a Vietnam vet makes it and a Vietnam vet gives it to another Vietnam vet.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I know another question that came up was surrounding the heart anchoring technique. One of our partners was saying, you know, with Vietnam veterans, is that ever seen as sort of intrusive? They just wanted to be mindful and respectful of that.
Well, it's a great question. First of all, anybody with PTSD usually their boundaries are out a little bit further. So number one, you don't want to be bringing your hand in without them seeing you coming. Number one, and as I mentioned earlier, you don't want, if you don't know that person, you know, anybody, but especially someone with PTSD, you don't want to be doing that. But you know, the idea of, you know, as I said, I can be in a throng of veterans at some type of event, and this has happened to me a couple of times where I'm standing next to one that's gotten triggered. They don't know me, I don't know them, but you know, I'll kind of look at them and let them, you know, and just place my hand kind of firmly on their shoulder or on their back. And what I do is I'm very, very, when you do that, you have to be very sensitive to their response. So if they flinch a little, just a tiny bit, then you take your hand back. But you will be surprised if you're there with the right intention. You're not trying to surprise them. You're not trying to fix them. You're not trying to do anything but essentially communicate that you are with them. That kind of grounding technique, and there's lots of others that you could use. This is just the one that we use. Can be very powerful. So whoever asked that question, she's right. It has to be done very sensitively. You don't just come in there charging, so to speak.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. We have had quite a few people come in with questions about the website being recorded or any handouts, and I do just want to confirm again, yes, this is being recorded. It will be put up on the We Honor Veterans website within the next few days. As I mentioned in one of the announcements, Deborah was kind enough to pass along some handouts and information, and those are up on our website right now. So what I'm going to do just really quickly is share our screen to show where on our website you can find them. I hope everyone can see. So just We Honor Veterans, our main page. If you go to Education Offerings, under webinars. So right here is where the webinar recording will be posted, and underneath this you have the objectives, the soul injury fact sheet, the Fallen Comrade ceremony at a glance that Deborah spoke about. This is a really useful practical tool, and then an article that was written by Deborah in the Boston Globe. So again, there are some tools for you to use as well. Okay.
Also, Catherine, there's one more that I thought I had sent that I evidently didn't. It's one that was just posted in a medical journal in the Arizona Geriatric Society Journal, which is a refereed journal. So I will send that to you because that's probably the most important one. And I apologize that I must not have gotten that to you.
Oh no, I may have missed that, but yeah, we'll be happy to put that one up as well. Okay, well, again, we have a few folks who have their hands raised. Again, you can either use the hand raise function or type something in the chat box and we'll be happy to get to you. Bob Lance, I know that you have had your hand raised for pretty much the entirety of the webinar, so we apologize for that. I have just unmuted you if you'd like to speak and share something or ask a question.
He waited so long he fell asleep.
He did, I think so.
You know, while we're waiting for him,
sure.
Catherine, one of the things I skipped, you know, many people know Paul Schutte. Paul Schutte is a Vietnam vet, professor at George Washington University in DC, retired now. But one of the things, and I think this is a hugely important thing for all of us to remember. I'm just going to read to you, if it's okay with you, a paragraph that he wrote.
Sure.
Okay, here's what he wrote. Once home, no one asked us about our experience. And even if they did, we lied or told stories about our buddies or some of the pranks or what the food was like. We did not tell them the truth. Why would we? Why would I want to burden my loved ones with my experiences of horror, of listening to the screams of the dying, of watching the dogs steal amputated limbs, of the chopper that landed with a huge canvas bag suspended under its belly while we were ordered to assemble 11 complete soldiers. Even now, I am finding it hard to reveal this truth to you. But these are the kinds of truths that each of my brothers and sisters who served in that war bring with us as we age and seek care and support. For those of you who will be caring for my generation of veterans, you need to open yourself to listen to our story. They have been our burden. And as we approach our later years, they become even heavier, and we need to lay them down before we die. So in my mind, Paul is really giving all of us our marching orders with that.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I know Bob was having some technical difficulties, but I see he did enter his question in the chat box. So his question was, what about the Vietnam era vets who didn't go to country but are feeling marginalized by the focus on only those who did?
Yeah, you know, not only that, but they often feel guilty that they didn't go. I mean, and that's, I think I had one slide that showed that as well. Yeah, I think again, it is that spectrum of sacrifice, and it is paying attention to all of that. And again, just hearing their story. I know that's a simplified answer, and it may be one that, but it's a complicated question. I mean, it really is, and there's no easy, simple answer other than to hear their story and validate their marginalization that they often do feel.
Yeah. Okay, so one other, we've had a few questions about the anchoring heart technique. Is there a step-by-step guide anywhere in the Opus Peace resources, or should folks maybe just go back and rewatch that part of the webinar?
We have a new website that should be up within a month, and it will be definitely on there.
Okay, thank you. Alrighty, so we have one more question. I wrote in the, sorry, this person was reposting their question. We're sorry if we missed it the first time. How might soul injury be complicated by ethno-racial minority status? Black and Hispanic Vietnam veterans experienced higher rates of and more severe combat trauma and experienced racism and discrimination when coming home.
Yeah, well, whoever wrote that, it's so true. I mean, it's absolutely true that marginalized populations, you know, and the racism that happens definitely causes the soul. And that's really one of our distinctions. You know, when you end up getting separated from yourself because of the names that you're called and made to feel like you're less than human or those types of things, I mean, that is a soul injury. And certainly marginalized populations are at huge risk for it. So yeah, definitely much higher risk because of that. I mean, you are taking, you know, it's one thing to have one trauma, but then you add another trauma and another trauma. And the research is really clear about, you know, multiple traumas increase your risk. But what this person, whoever asked that question, is also bringing out is it's not just PTSD, although a lot of marginalized people and have PTSD from trauma, but definitely big with soul injury because it affects their self-identity when you're called names and when you are not allowed the same privileges and when you don't get the same promotions and all of those kinds of things. And, you know, then that's where your identity gets affected. And that's more than PTSD. So, you know, that's the soul injury that often occurs. And when it starts affecting your own identity, when you believe it or when you know, accept it or those types of things.
Yeah, great. Thanks for answering that. Let's see, I'm not seeing any more questions coming into the chat box. Again, if there's anyone out there that wants to share a story, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, if you're more comfortable, please share it via email. Again, you can either send it to my email directly. It's Kemp, that's KKE, M as in Mary, P as in Peter, at nhpco.org. Otherwise, you can just send it to our general Veterans Contact Us page. It's just veterans with an S at nhpco.org as well. Again, we would really appreciate you sharing any stories or any practical tips that you have to share. Let's see.
Catherine, I would just add that if any of you think of questions or want more of an explanation, you can email me at Deborah, D-E-B-O-R-A-H, Grassman, Grassman, at Opus, O-P-U-S, Peace, P-E-A-C-E.org. Deborah Grassman at opuspeace.org, and I'll be glad to answer your question. I don't always answer them fast, but you will eventually get in a week or two. I'm not great at reading my emails, but I do read them, and when I do, I will definitely answer.
All right. Well, yeah, it does look like we have just a few more questions, and so this one is interesting. When did the veteran pinning program start?
Well, I mentioned to you the quality of life program that we did, quality of life gatherings that we did every day. We did 2 patients every single day on our unit. We had a 14-bed unit. So we actually started these, it's been nearly 20 years ago, where we did these little pinning ceremonies, and they were just so profound, but they also precipitated these stories, and then that precipitated the untold story and the unfinished story and the stuff that was still bothering them, that type of thing. So we saw the power of that. And then when the VA and Diane Jones were starting the Hospice Veteran Partnership, and that was back in, I'm going to say, about 2001. I mean, it's been a long time now. And Florida was the pilot state. Florida and Maine were the 2 pilot states. And so I was on that original pilot committee. And as we're trying to figure out all these different things, one of the things I brought up was just these pinning ceremonies that we had been doing for years. And so then, so we came up and we actually designed a pin. Somebody on the committee designed the pin, and then we had the little card that went with it. And I then the Wounded Warriors, their last battle film came out, and I talked about it there and taught people how to do that. So it literally started at the bedside at a VA, doing hospice care and pinning them. And then the Hospice Veteran Partnership picked it up, and then another year or two, and then NHPCO recognized all of this and started developing the We Honor Veterans program, and then that became part of that program. So yeah, it started with just a little small team of hospice nurses and social worker and chaplain at the bedside. And has gotten formalized. And now what's so exciting is you all are doing things that we didn't even dream of. We just did these little ceremonies every day at the bedside, and you all have taken it even bigger. And, we just love watching it to see where all it has gone. Who would have ever guessed?
Oh boy. Okay, let's see. We have a few more questions. One from Mary. She said, love the presentation. Most, if not all, of the examples have been in males. So are there any specific issues that pertain to women, vets, and hospice?
Well, a lot of what I have seen as far as trauma goes is there was, as I said, a high incidence of sexual assault, and that often manifests as PTSD, and it often has that overlying soul injury. So we often did see that surface at the time. And again, kind of like the same as the racism, women, I mean, we can say that in the military that there's no sexism, and we can say that all the time, but I can tell you the stories that I heard, I would say that that's not necessarily true. There is still, just as there is still racism, as much as we'd like to pretend like there is not, what I can say also is we can pretend like there is no sexism in the military anymore, and I would tell you that what I have seen would not necessarily support that all the time. So you do have ways in which women had to prove themselves. They had to be sometimes extra stoic. We talk about the stoicism associated with men. But sometimes, what I've heard the women say a lot is, look, we had to be extra stoic because we had to prove to them, that we were not, wimpy, and that we, in tears and all that kind of stuff. So that hardened, stoic outward core can sometimes be especially difficult for women to let down because they had to really prove themselves in that way. So, and Marie, you're sitting right next to me. Remember, here's Marie, a Vietnam War veteran, and you tried to join. She tried to join.
When I came home from Vietnam, my husband and I went to a support group for Vietnam veterans. And so the one fellow stopped me at the door and he said, "This isn't for the wives. You have to go someplace else." So once he found out that I was a Vietnam veteran, the whole situation changed. And for the most part, I did belong to the VFW in our hometown, and I met nothing but admiration and honor. These World War II vets and Korean War vets, they just were very supportive. So my situation was altogether different.
So, and I think the other thing that I've seen a lot, and you saw that one slide on the screen, and that was something that a Vietnam nurse had told me one time. The decisions, a lot of times these nurses were, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, and they were making, in mass casualty situations, making decisions about, who got surgery and who didn't. Marie did not tell her story today, but when she does tell her story, she talks about those kinds of decisions. When they had mass casualties, they had 20 beds, and they had, all these soldiers, wounded soldiers, and then sometimes they'd have North Viet Cong to be occupying beds, and then all these dilemmas, decision-making dilemmas that they, are faced with. And then I'm going to tell the story because Marie tears up so much when she says this. One of the things that happened was one time Marie in the mail received a rubbing from the Vietnam Wall of a soldier who had died, and the friend of Marie, who was in DC at the wall, who saw this person's name, took a rubbing of it and mailed it to Marie. And when Marie opened it up in the mail, the note said, "I know how close you were to this person. So I, I got the etching off his name and sent it to you because I knew you would want to have it." And one of the things Marie still struggles with is that she has no memory of this person. And what haunts her is she doesn't know what else she has blocked out. And, because as an officer, she was an officer, and they kind of separated themselves from the enlisted because they got killed. And so, they didn't form relationships with them because it was just too painful for them to grieve their loss when they got killed. So, any rate, so that still haunts her. And I'm amazed when we do fallen comrade ceremonies and Marie tells that story, how many people come up afterward and say that same thing haunts them. It haunts them that they can't remember what they might have forgotten. That's something I never would have thought of. I was, well, if you don't remember it, then it must not be an issue. That would be me. But I have heard this enough, not only from Marie, but others, that haunts them, that they're, that they don't know if there's something they did or didn't do that they need to take responsibility for. So, see all these different dimensions. And those are the kinds of things that surface at the end of life often, I think. That's when people really get truthful. I always call it the unvarnished truth comes. I had one veteran say, well, now while I'm dying, there's no time for me to be lying to myself. And it's the truth. That's why we hear stuff that others don't.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we have time just for one more question. Quickly, before that, though, I know we've had a lot of questions coming in about certificates of attendance. So we're not offering certificates or continuing education. If for some reason for your supervisor's needs, you need a confirmation that you were here, reach out to me, again, Kay Kemp, and I can check the attendee list and just send you a quick email of confirmation that you did in fact attend. Another thing, I know Deborah sort of opened the floodgates open on the level 5 program. This is something that is still in the pilot phase, and we're wrapping up the initial first year. And once that's done, this program will be open to all qualifying level 4 partners that meet the requirements. So stay tuned, more info to come. That will be later in the year, probably late fall. So again, more information will definitely be coming. Okay, so want to just go ahead and give Deborah one more question. And this is from Arlene. She says, my husband was in Operation Enduring Freedom and my father-in-law was in Vietnam. I would ideally like to have both of them help make the Vietnam era beads. For the pinning ceremony, do you also present a certificate and a small commemorative gift? Do you hold the pinning ceremonies on a rolling basis throughout the year rather than for Veterans Day only? So that's actually a really good question. So surrounding the beads, or are there any other sort of collaborative ceremonial events that veterans from different eras could do?
Well, I think we always have them when we have Vietnam, like Marie. We're lucky we have Marie always in our midst, and John Drinkard and Bill Cassay with the Theric. We have a lot of Vietnam vets that are kind of on our staff, so we always have them. So when we encounter, so to speak, a Vietnam veteran, that we can do them without any so-called ceremony, although when we present it, we do it in a small ceremony. But we do Fallen Comrade ceremonies all the time, and we have adjusted the Fallen Comrade ceremony to absolutely include the Vietnam veterans, and just like we did with Bruce that you heard, and then they come forward and they are pinned by other Vietnam veterans. So to answer her question, I think it's great to do it around Veterans Day, or to do it like in Maryland on March 30th, which the state of Maryland and their legislature have declared that as Vietnam, welcome your Vietnam veteran back home day. So I think that's great, but it definitely does not have to be. You can do it if you have a dying veteran in a home and he's a Vietnam vet, then you call on your Vietnam vet team and say, okay, we have a Vietnam vet, you know, and see if they want that connection, and then provide that.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, well, we're right at the, wow, it's almost 4:30. Thank you to everyone again for joining us and for staying on. We're so glad that you all were able to participate. And as always, we're so grateful to Deborah and the team at Opus Peace, as well as our other panelists that were able to join us today. Again, the recording will be posted up on the We Honor Veterans website, and please feel free to reach out if you later think of another question that pops into your head and you'd like for us or Deborah to answer. We'll be happy to get that done. And again, please share your stories. Yes, just thank you again to everyone participating. Deborah, I don't know if you had any sort of parting words for folks.
Well, you know, I just feel so humbled that you had more than 1,000 people on this call, which just, again, tells me how willing people are to serve. And I just want to encourage you to continue with that willingness, because our Vietnam vets need us. They need you specifically. And if, you know what, the more we can learn, the more we can grow, and we can do it together, the more effective we're going to be. And that's only going to help us learn things that are going to help with our Iraq War veterans and others, you know, the subsequent wars that are coming. And when they start dying, you know, in the future, we will have the lessons from our Vietnam vets to bring to them. So again, I just, you know, truly feel honored to be asked to do this. And Catherine, again, I just want to commend NHPCO for recognizing the need and we're changing hospice for veterans. I mean, that's what you've done.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, thank you so much. We definitely appreciate that, and we will we will continue doing as much as we can. All right, well, with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And again, we hope you'll be joining us for our next webinar with Deborah that will be at the end of August. We'll be sending out some more information and invites shortly, so make sure to check your inboxes for that. All right, everyone, take care and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.